The train set her down at Sable Creek in the last hour of a March afternoon, and the wind came off the flats to meet her before any person did. Adelaide Kerr went down the iron stair, 1 foot at a time, the way she had learned to do it, the right foot first and the left brought after. The platform took her weight. There was a hitch in it. There always was, and there had been since she was 19 years old, and somewhere east of Omaha she had stopped apologizing for it. Wyoming Territory in 1883 was mostly weather and distance. Sable Creek sat where a freight road crossed a creek that ran hard in spring and dried to gravel by August. There were 2 streets. There was a church with no bell yet, a bank with a false front taller than the building behind it, a livery, a hotel that called itself a hotel, and at the end of the road, a long, low store with a freight yard behind it and a painted sign that had faded down to the word Ward. 3 other women had come off the train with her. They stood in a loose line near the baggage cart with their trunks at their heels, and none of them looked at the others, because looking at the others made it a line, and none of them wanted to be standing in a line. Hollis Pike came down the platform with a folded paper in his hand, and his hat pushed back so people could see he was friendly. He was a passage broker out of St. Joseph. He advanced the fare west against a term of labor, and he sold the term to whoever met the train, and he took his percentage off the top, and he had done it long enough that he had stopped hearing how it sounded. Ladies, if you would step forward as I call you. Adelaide had signed the paper in a boarding house parlor in Missouri with a cracked window behind her and 11 cents in her pocket. She had read every line of it first, which had surprised Pike, and she had made him strike 1 clause and initial the change, which had surprised him more. She knew exactly what she owed. $7.40 of fare, minus the $4 she had already paid down in Kansas City by keeping books for a hotel that could not keep its own. Men had come up from the street to stand along the platform rail. Some had come to hire. Most had come to look. That was the part nobody wrote down in the papers, that a woman crossing a country with a debt on her name would be looked at by 40 men in a town she had never heard of and would have to stand there and let it happen with her chin level. The first woman went for $25 to a rancher who wanted a cook for a crew of 9. The second went for $22 to the hotel. The third, who was young and pretty and frightened, went for $31 after 2 men bid against each other and enjoyed doing it more than either of them enjoyed the outcome. Then Pike said her name. Miss Adelaide Kerr of Illinois. 24 years of age, educated. A fine hand, gentlemen, a fine hand with letters and with figures both. She came forward, she took the 6 steps to the front of the cart, and every one of those steps announced itself. Right foot, left foot dragged a half beat behind, right foot. Her boot heel struck the boards unevenly, and the sound carried, because the wind had dropped just then the way wind does when you would rather it did not. Somebody at the rail made a noise through his nose. Pike started at $20 because he had to start somewhere. The rail was quiet. He came down to 15 and told them about her hand with letters again. He came down to 10 and mentioned that she could read a bill of lading. He came down to 5 and stopped talking about her at all and started talking about how a young woman would season into the work and how a limp did not signify in a kitchen. Nobody bid. Adelaide looked at the far end of the street where the road went out of town toward the north, and she kept her face still. And she thought about her father, who had taught her to add a column downward and then upward to catch herself, and who had died owing money to a bank in Rock Island that took the house and the clock and the desk and the 6 good chairs. Nobody had bid on her. She had known before she came west that this might happen. Knowing a thing does not thin it out any. It only means you do not get the mercy of surprise. Pike opened his mouth to drop the number again, and a voice came from the back of the crowd, out near the freight wagons, flat and unhurried and not loud. $7. Men turned. The man walking up through them was somewhere past 40, big through the shoulders in the way of a man who had loaded wagons for 20 years, with a beard going gray on one side faster than the other, and a canvas coat gone pale at the elbows. He did not hurry. He came up to the cart and put a hand on the wheel rim. Pike blinked at him. The bidding stands at 5, Mr. Ward. There is no bidding. Nobody bid. I'm saying 7. You may have her for 5. I said 7. Adelaide looked at him then, straight on. He was not looking at her leg. That was the first thing she noticed, and she noticed it the way you notice a lamp being lit in a dark room. Every man on that platform had looked at her leg. This one was looking at Hollis Pike with a kind of tired patience, the way a man looks at a fence post that has gone crooked again. Pike took the $7, 2 paper dollars and 5 silver, counted into his palm, and a line drawn through her name on the folded paper, and it was done in under a minute. 22 years of a life and a broken bone and a father in the ground in Illinois. All of it settled for the price of a good hat. The man picked up her trunk before she could reach for the handle. He did not ask if she needed help with it, and he did not offer help with it. He simply took the trunk because he had come to get the trunk, and that was the second thing she noticed. Josiah Ward, Adelaide Kerr. He set the trunk in the bed of a wagon and stood a moment with his hand on the sideboard. "I want to say a thing straight off, Miss Kerr, and then we will not have to keep going back to it. That paper is torn up. You do not owe me $7, and you do not owe me a term of labor, and you do not owe me a day. If you want to get back on that train Thursday, I will buy the ticket, and there will be no ill feeling in it." She stood very still in the wind. "And if I do not want to get on the train, then there is work at the store and a room over the harness room with a stove in it, and I pay wages, and the wages are the same wages I would pay anybody. Why did you say 7? He looked down the street for a while before he answered, and she came to know later that this was how he answered anything that mattered, because 5 was what he was going to say next, and I have been to enough of these to know what it does to a person to be the cheapest thing sold in a town on a Tuesday. It was not a price. There is no price. I just did not want the number in the air to be 5. The wagon went down the street with her trunk in the back and Adelaide walking beside it, because he had not offered to hand her up, and because after 4 days on a train, she wanted the ground under her more than she wanted the seat. The store that belonged to Josiah Ward was 2 buildings that had grown into one. The front half sold flour and nails and coal oil and bolt cloth and coffee and lamp chimneys and the small necessary things 100 families needed and could not make. The back half was a freight office, and behind that was a yard with 4 wagons and a barn and a corral, and the freight was the real business. Ward hauled to the ranches north and to the 2 mining camps west, and he had contracts with both, and he had held those contracts 11 years. Her room over the harness room had a bed, a chair, a washstand, a small iron stove, and a window that looked at the mountains. It was more room than she had had in 3 years. She sat on the edge of the bed in her coat until the light went out of the window, and then she got up and unpacked because sitting was not going to do anything for her. The first week she swept and sorted button cards and learned where the coffee mill was kept and stood behind the counter while Mrs. Cobb from the boarding house looked her over as thoroughly as a woman can look at another woman while discussing the price of dried apples. The town had opinions. She heard 3 of them through the wall of the storeroom in the first 4 days. She had been bought. She had been bought cheap. She was a charity case Josiah Ward had taken on because he had gone strange since his wife died, and a man who goes strange once will go strange again. Adelaide let them talk. She had learned a long while ago that you cannot argue a town out of a thing. You can only outlast it. What she could do was see. And what she saw in the first week was that the store was well run and the freight office was not. The freight office had a tall desk and 2 ledgers on it and a spike file with a fist of yellow weight tickets jammed onto it and a pigeonhole cabinet with paper crammed in sideways. There was a smell of dust and cold ash. Nobody worked at that desk on a daily basis. A man named Merritt Vane came in Tuesdays and Fridays, kept the accounts, wrote the bills, took the receipts to the bank, and left. On the 9th day, a teamster named Tom Leary came in from the North Road and dropped a sheaf of weight tickets on the counter and asked her to tally the load for the run sheet because Vane would not be in until Friday, and the Nance outfit wanted a figure. She tallied it. Then she tallied it upward to catch herself, the way her father had taught her. Then she looked at the run sheet from the previous month that was still lying under the counter, and she looked at the tickets again, and something went quietly wrong in the back of her mind, the way a note goes wrong in a hymn when one voice is a half step under. She did not say anything. She wrote the figure and gave it to Leary and went back to the button cards. That night Josiah came through the store to bank the stove and found her at the tall desk with a candle, going through the spike file. "You are meant to be asleep. I am meant to be a great many things." He stood in the doorway a while. "Do you know figures, Miss Kerr? My father was a county assessor in Illinois and then a store clerk when the county went to another man over politics. He taught me to keep a book when I was 8 because it was the only thing he had to give me that could not be taken by a bank. I kept the books of the store where he worked from the time I was 14. When he died, I kept them another year for the man who bought it, and then that man married, and his wife did not care for a young woman at the desk. And that was that. Josiah came in and set the lamp down. And the leg. She had been waiting 9 days for somebody to ask it straight instead of looking. It was almost a relief. A wagon went off the road into a cut on the Rock River in a rain, and my mother was in it and did not come out of it, and I came out of it with a thigh bone in 2 places and a country doctor who did the best he could with what he had. It set short. That is the whole of it. It aches in the cold and it will not run, and it does not signify one particle when a person is sitting at a desk. He nodded once, slow, the way a man nods when a thing has been filed where it belongs. I will tell you mine then, since we are trading. My wife was Ellen. 3 years ago in November she took a fever and was gone in 9 days. She kept these books. She kept them from the first year we opened this place, and she kept them better than I ever did. And after she was gone I could not sit at that desk. I could not look at the hand she wrote in. So I gave the books to Merritt Vane at the bank, and I have not looked at a column of figures in 3 years, and God help me, I have been glad not to. He picked the lamp back up. Go to bed, Miss Kerr. She did not go to bed. She sat there another hour with the candle, and she found the second thing. The next morning there was a stool behind the counter that had not been there the night before. It was tall, made from good pine, with a wide seat and a footrail across the front, set low enough that a person could put both boots on it and take the weight off a bad hip while she worked. The joints were pegged. Somebody had sanded the edges by hand and rubbed oil into the grain. Josiah was out in the yard shoeing a wagon horse and did not come in until noon, and when he came in he did not mention the stool, then or ever. He got his coffee and looked at the weather and went out again. Adelaide stood beside it for a full minute before she sat on it. Then she sat on it and pulled the ledger over and worked until dinner and did not have to stop at 11 to lean on the shelf the way she had every other day. She thought about the fact that he had never once asked her whether her leg hurt. He had simply built the answer and left it where she would find it. Spring came on. The creek ran high and brown and then dropped. Adelaide learned the freight business the way she learned everything from the paper up. She learned that Ward hauled at 11 cents the hundredweight to the ranches and 14 to the camps, and that the ranchers paid on the season and the camps paid on the month, and that the weight tickets came in from the yard scale in duplicate, 1 to the customer and 1 to the spike. And she learned that the duplicates did not always match. She found 6 of them the first month. Then 11 more. A ticket to the Nance outfit written for 940 pounds, and the office copy of the same ticket, same date, same wagon, reading 940, and the ledger entry reading 690. A ticket to a small outfit called the Pell Brothers, written at 14 cents, the hundredweight when they should have been hauled at 11, and the ledger showing 11, and the difference nowhere at all. It was not a large theft. That was the craft of it. It was a small theft repeated 140 times over 3 years, $3 here and 5 there, never enough to make a man count twice, and always in 2 directions at once. The small ranchers were billed high, and Josiah was credited low, and the space in between was a man named Merritt Vane, twice a week with a leather case. She wanted to be wrong. She reconstructed the whole of 1882 from the tickets, every haul, every rate, every entry, on butcher paper spread across the desk at night after the store was shut, in a hand so small she had to hold the candle close. It took her 19 nights. On the 10th of May, she watched him do it. Merritt Vane was a narrow man of about 35, who wore a town coat and had soft hands and a manner of speaking to people that made them feel they had almost understood him. He came in that Friday and took the tickets off the spike and sat at the tall desk with his back to the store, and Adelaide, kneeling at the low shelf sorting lamp chimneys 10 feet behind him, watched him take up a ticket from the Nance Hall, read it, take up his pen, and write a different number in the book. He blotted it. He put the ticket at the bottom of the stack. He went on to the next one. She stayed on her knees with a lamp chimney in each hand, and her heart going hard, and her face, she hoped, doing nothing at all. Then he turned around. "You're very quiet back there, Miss Kerr. I'm counting chimneys, are you? And how many are there?" 22, and 4 of them cracked, and the crate they came in was billed for 26 sound ones, which I have written on the invoice for the drummer. Vane smiled at her. It was a good smile. That was the trouble with him. A great head for figures. Ward tells everyone. Bought himself a clerk for $7 and got a wonder. It makes a fine story in a town this size. People do so like to know what a thing cost. He put his hat on and took up the leather case. I would be careful, all the same, of sitting at another person's desk. A woman in your position has very little to fall back on. There is no bank in this territory that would take a word of yours against a word of mine, and I would hate to see you learn that the hard way at your age. He went out. The bell over the door rang and settled. Adelaide put down the lamp chimneys, because her hands were not steady enough to be trusted with glass, and she sat on the stool a while, and then she got out the butcher paper and went back to work, because he had told her exactly what he was afraid of, and she was not going to waste it. The thing broke open on the last Saturday in May, and it broke open badly. Aunt Nance came in at 10 in the morning with a bill in his hand, and his hat off and his neck red, and he was not a shouting man, but he had reached the end of the country where quiet works. He had been billed for the spring haul at a figure that would take the last of what he had, and he had 2 boys and a mortgage, and a well that had gone brackish, and he was not going to get through the winter on what was left. 11 years I have hauled with you, Ward. 11 years and my father before me. And this is the paper you send me. Josiah took the bill and read it, and his face went slowly and terribly still, because the figure at the bottom of it was not any figure he would ever have put there, and because half the store was standing there listening. Adelaide came around the end of the counter. Mr. Nance, do you keep your tickets? Nance looked at her the way a man looks at a stranger who has spoken in the middle of his own funeral. I keep every scrap of paper that comes on my place. Ma am. Because my father lost a section of ground once over a receipt he could not find. Then I would be obliged if you would bring me every weight ticket from the spring haul and from all of last year, and I will tell you inside of 2 hours where that figure came from. Merritt Vane had come in behind Nance. He came through the crowd with his coat open and his voice pitched to Carrie, warm and reasonable and sorry for everybody. Miss Kerr, that is quite enough. Ward, I have held my peace on this out of regard for you, but you have let a woman off a passage broker platform sit at the accounts of this house for 2 months, and now we have angry customers in the street. I have been at this desk 3 years. Nothing was wrong with these books until she touched them. That is the first honest thing you have said in 3 years. There was nothing wrong with them that anybody had looked at. Vane turned and put his hand flat on the counter and leaned, and the stool went over sideways off the end of the counter and cracked against the floor, and the sound of it stopped the store. You were sold for $7, he told her, and it was not warm any longer, and everybody in the room heard the whole shape of him come through. $7 in front of the entire town, and no man in it would give 5. That is what your word is worth here. That is the exact figure. Do not stand in a room with me and use it. Nobody spoke. Adelaide bent down and picked up the stool and set it on its feet and checked the pegs with her thumb, and one had started, and she pushed it back in. Then she straightened up and looked at Merritt Vane. You're quite right about the $7. It is a true fact, and I cannot argue it away, and I am not going to try. So I will not ask this town to take my word. I will ask it to take its own paper. She turned to Josiah. Mr. Ward, I'm going to ask you for something, and I want you to think before you give it, because once it is given, you cannot take it back, and there will be a cost to you either way. Ask it. Give me the books in front of these people. Open the office and let me lay all of it out on the counter, every ticket and every entry from January of 1882 forward, and let any man in this room bring his own copies and set them beside mine. Not my word, not his word, just the paper, side by side, where anybody can read it. Josiah Ward looked at her a long moment. Then he looked at Merritt Vane, and something moved behind his face that had been asleep for 3 years. He went into the office and came back with both ledgers under his arm and the spike file in his hand, and set the whole of it down on the counter with a sound like a door closing. Bring your tickets, he told the room. Every one of you. Bring them today. They came all afternoon. Aunt Nance came back with a cigar box. The Pell brothers came with theirs in a flour sack. Mrs. Cobb, who had never hauled a pound of freight in her life, came anyway and stood at the back with her arms folded because she was not going to miss it. Adelaide worked at the counter from noon until dark with the ledgers open and her butcher paper spread and the tall stool under her, and she did not hurry, and she explained every line to whoever asked, twice if they needed it twice. Here is the ticket from your place, Mr. Nance, in your hand and in the hand of the yard man, for £940 on the 14th of April. Here is the office copy of the same ticket, same date, same wagon, same weight. Here is the entry in the ledger for that day, in a different hand, for £690. £250 went missing between the yard and the book, and the freight on it was charged to you and never entered as received by this house. And here it is again on the 19th. And here on the 2nd of May. And here. She turned the pages, and the men leaned in over the counter with their hats in their hands and read their own names. It came to $211.60 over 3 years and 4 months, taken from 11 small outfits who could least stand it, and from a man who had stopped looking at his own accounts because his wife had died and her handwriting was in them. Somewhere in the middle of it, Merritt Vane went out the door. Nobody stopped him. There was nothing left in that room for him to argue with, and he had the sense to know it, and he was on the Thursday train. When it was done, Josiah Ward stood up in front of the whole of it and said the thing plainly, because he was not a man for speeches and would only have ruined it by trying. Every dollar of it comes back. Not the bank, not the law, which would take 2 years and eat the difference. Me. Out of this house, starting Monday, and if it takes me through the winter, then it takes me through the winter. That is the first thing. He put his hand flat on the ledger. The second thing is this. Adelaide Kerr keeps the books of this business from tonight, not as a favor and not as a kindness, and not because I bought a paper off a broker in March, because she is the best hand with figures within 100 miles of this creek, and every man in this room has just spent an afternoon watching her prove it. Her word goes on the accounts. Her name goes in the book. He opened the front ledger to a clean page and turned it around on the counter and held out his pen. Write it. She wrote it. Adelaide Kerr in her small, careful hand, and under it the date, and under that the first entry of a book that would balance. The store cleared out slow, the way people do when they want to keep talking about a thing on the porch before they have to go home and tell it. Aunt Nance shook her hand at the door with both of his. Then it was the two of them and the lamp. Josiah sat down on a nail keg across from her and rubbed his face with both hands. I am sorry for what he said about the $7. He was not wrong. He was wrong in every way a man can be wrong. He only had the number right. Adelaide closed the ledger and set her palm flat on the cover. I want to tell you something, and then I'm going to go up to my room, because if I do not say it tonight, I will lose my nerve and be sensible about it in the morning. When I stood on that platform in March and Hollis Pike came down from 20 to 5, and no man in that crowd made a sound, I decided a thing about myself. I decided that they had all seen something true that I had been arguing with since I was 19, that I was a thing with a fault in it, and the fault was the first fact about me, and everything else I might be was going to have to be discovered underneath it by somebody willing to dig. I did not have to dig for 1 minute. I know. That is what I am telling you. You said $7 in front of 40 men, and then you tore up the paper before we got off the platform, and then you built me a stool and never once said why. And tonight you set the whole of your business on a counter in public and let me take it apart in front of the town on nothing but my say so. Do you know what that is? That is not charity. Charity would have been the 5. That is somebody putting his own name behind the worth of me before I'd proved one thing to him. Josiah looked at the floor for a while. Ellen used to say that the only real question about any person is whether the world ever gave them one honest chance to be what they were. She said most people go their whole lives and never get asked. I've thought about that more in the last 2 months than in the 3 years before it. He stood up and took his hat off the peg. I'm going to say the rest of it in a month or two, when you have wages of your own put by and a place in this town that does not depend on me, so that you can say no to it clean if you want to. I would not have you answering a question while you still have a trunk in a room over my harness room. But I want you to know the question is coming, so it does not take you unawares." Adelaide sat with her hand on the ledger and listened to him bank the stove in the other room. "Take your time, Mr. Ward. I've gotten fairly good at waiting." He came back through with the lamp and stopped in the doorway. "You are the only person in this town who calls me Mr. Ward. I am aware of it. The money went back over 11 months. It was a hard winter and they ate a good deal of beans, and Josiah sold 2 wagons, and the store carried no new stock from October to March, and by the following August, the last of it was paid to the last of the Pell brothers with a receipt written in a small, careful hand. The freight business doubled inside 2 years, which surprised the town and did not surprise Adelaide Kerr at all. 11 outfits who had been quietly robbed and then quietly repaid told other outfits about it, and out in that country, a reputation traveled further than a wagon did. Ward took the mail contract in 1885, then the contract to the new camp on the far side of the divide. She was married in the church in September of 1884, which was the month after they finally got a bell. She walked up the aisle at her own pace, and the whole town waited, and the hitch in it was the plainest sound in the building, and there was not one person in those pews who heard it as anything but Adelaide coming. She kept her hand in the books. It never occurred to either of them that she would stop. There was a new sign on the front window by then with 2 lines of gold paint on it, and the second line read, A. Kerr Ward, Accounts. In the winter of 1887, a boy of about 9 came in out of the snow with his father to buy coal oil, and while the men talked, he wandered down the counter and put his hand on the tall pine stool with the worn place in the seat and the footrail rubbed pale by 20,000 hours of 2 boots, and he started to climb up on it. Adelaide looked over the top of the ledger. Not that one. The boy came down off it fast. "Why not that one, Ma Am? Because that is the seat of the person who keeps the books of this house, and it was made for her by hand and no one else sits in it. When you have a place of your own, you will understand it. A chair that somebody built for you without being asked is not furniture." The boy thought this over with great seriousness and went off to find his father. Adelaide turned back to the page. It was the last week of the year, and the columns were coming down toward the bottom of the sheet where they would meet, and outside the window the snow was going sideways down the road that went north out of Sable Creek, the same road she had looked at once from a baggage cart, while 40 men decided she was not worth $5. She added the column downward, then she added it upward to catch herself, the way her father had taught her when she was 8 years old, because he had nothing else to give her that a bank could not take. The 2 figures agreed. She had come into this country owing $7.40, with a bone that set short and a name nobody would say out loud, and every fact about her had been written by other people in a hand she never got to read. Now the accounts of a whole valley ran through her hands, and the men who hauled on that road took her figure over their own, and her name was the first name in the book, and it was there because a man had refused to let the number in the air be 5. She blotted the page. Then she sat a while in the warm and let herself have it.